A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're going to get a focus today on what we might even call a gift of generosity. Our special guest worked for many years as a human rights lawyer in India, fighting slavery with International Justice Mission. And she worked for 10 years overseeing empowerment projects for the poorest of the poor in India, where rice is the staple food for survival. She knows deeply on so many levels how generosity matters. And it may be that generosity is not really an optional extra for Christian believers. Martine Wilson has wrestled with how we might more deeply understand God's gift of generosity and how we as Christian believers can be unleashed anew when we embrace a gift of giving. Now, we might be surprised just how far a little generosity goes. Martine Wilson is the Australian Director of Generosity Path. She's the catalyst for generosity movements in the Oceania region. Generosity Path is a not-for-profit, privately fully funded organisation that aims to lead Christians to a life of greater generosity. Martine is in Melbourne. Martine, a special welcome along to 2020.
Hi, Neil. It's wonderful to be here with you and your listeners.
Martine, let me start with something which I think is really important about your role and the organisation that you work with, Generosity Path, because you're fully privately funded. In other words, you're not necessarily, You're not asking today, hey, make donations to me or us. That's a pretty impressive way to start to talk about generosity.
Yes. And some people actually find it quite disarming. When they do encounter Generosity Path, they are expecting that we are at some point going to ask them to give to us, and that's one of the key commitments or promises that we can make because of our generous funders, that we'll never ask you for money or allow anyone else to ask you for money if you're participating in one of our events.
So a wonderful way to talk about generosity today, and I might say that your reputation goes before you, known as someone with a soft heart that breaks for the needs around you. And you experienced all those years working with the poorest of the poor in India. How have those sorts of experience helped to shape your thoughts around generosity?
Oh, well, it was a very generous introduction, actually, Neil. I feel quite humbled by what you've shared. I mean, anyone who's travelled to India knows that it's not a place that you can go to and not be changed. It's very overwhelming in many respects, the needs that you see around you. But it is also a place that does bring hope. You know, you see and you remember as a believer that each person is created by God and deserving of worth and dignity, and that his heart breaks for the lost and the vulnerable, which you do see en masse in a place like India. But I think what I also witnessed in India was the power of small acts of generosity, that they can, when people do take steps of courage, of sacrifice, and they're infectious. They lead to other people wanting to be part of that and to bringing change to their communities, even with very little resources or tools in their hands. These small acts of generosity add up to make a huge impact. And yes, so I got to see that many times with I spent 1 year in India volunteering with International Justice Mission and serving as a lawyer alongside Christian lawyers there who were trying to find cases of bonded labour slavery and then work with the government and the police to rescue victims out of those situations of oppression. And it was incredible to see Indian Christians serving in really hard places because they felt this calling from God to make a difference, to give up opportunities that they might have otherwise had in their career in India or even abroad, and to really make a difference in being salt and light in their country and in their villages even.
I'm intrigued by this thought that generosity is infectious. The contagious nature of one person breaking out of the crowd and exercising generosity affects others in the crowd to also do that. How do you describe, I mean, there you were, 10 years working with the poorest of the poor and no doubt saying, why doesn't the rest of the world know what's going on here? But you've seen this sort of infectiousness of what happens when people do get generous, not only from the outside with whatever funds might come in, but also from within the communities that you work. The poor people are very, very generous themselves. How do you describe this infectiousness?
Yeah, great. Thanks for asking about that, Neil. Well, the 10 years I spent working with Tear Fund Australia, and I was based in Melbourne, but I was overseeing Tear Fund's partnerships in India for a lot of that time. And some of those partner organisations were working in the hardest places of India where life was a daily struggle to even put a meal on the table. And I had the chance to visit some communities in rural parts of India, but also in some of the biggest slums in Mumbai, and sit with women often, and women who had very limited educational opportunities. Some didn't even know how to write their own name. And these were women who had been given a little bit of hope. Hope was invested in them, value was invested in them by the Indian Christians who were serving with these partner organisations. And these women just thrived with that tiny little gift of hope and dignity and some skills. Often they would be given skills, but also a new perspective to think about their life and how to bring change. And once these women were given that, it was just like, they were like firecrackers, to be honest, Neil. It just, they had such a vision for how they wanted to then change, share that change and that hope with those around them, their communities. I remember sitting with some incredible women in a big slum in Mumbai, and they had come up with plays to perform on the streets of their slum, educating women about the dangers of trafficking out of Mumbai. And they were just so passionate about this issue that they were desperate to change, to share that with those in their community who didn't know about it.
Absolutely amazing. Yep. Tell us another one.
Yes.
Yep.
Well, I'd love to tell you also about a story that I've only heard more recently since I've been working with Generosity Path, and it's a story called A Handful of Rice. And this is a story that comes out of a state in northeastern India called Mizoram. And it's a story that paints a powerful picture of how everyday small acts of generosity are contagious and can have a huge impact. They started in this community the Handful of Rice practice back in 1910, and there were not many Christians in Mizoram at this time. And they had this idea that whenever each family would cook a meal, they would scoop out a handful of rice from their bag of rice and put it aside for the church. And they would bring it. So I'll just say that again. Every time a family would cook rice, cook a meal for their family. They would scoop out a handful of rice and set it aside for their church. A really small act, but they would then bring that as an offering to their church community, and they saw it as a way of showing gratitude to the Lord, that if they had enough to cook and provide for their family, then they had enough to give to the Lord. And from that offering, the church would then sell the rice at a lower than market rate to those most in need in the community. They used funds raised from that to set up schools for the poor and medical centres, training centres, to send out missionaries and to grow the church. And this handful of rice story meal is just incredible because, you know, so often we think, and I think the narrative in Australia a lot at the moment is that life is hard, we've got to think about ourselves, we don't have anything to give, we'll start giving later when we've got more. But the power of this story really is that giving isn't about having or not having. We all have something to contribute. And when this handful of rice practice was first collected, it amounted to about an equivalent of less than $1 a day, about 80 rupees. The practice has grown over since 1910 to 2024. Our team at Generosity Path have just recently been back to some of the churches in Mizoram to get an update on this story and the impact of this practice on the people of Mizoram. And it's had huge impacts. But what they told us is that the handful of rice practice has raised over that time more than $25 million.
Wow.
And that's just from a handful of rice, yeah.
And really, I mean, I want to unpack this a little bit more with you as we go on in our conversation, but what I'm hearing from this story is no one is too poor to contribute.
This is 2020 with Neil Johnson, helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision.
I think we are in the middle of a heart-to-heart conversation about generosity today, and, you know, it might be a little aside, but November is called Generosity Month, and this is a time of year when there's a lot of different charities and church and parachurch and mission organisations that are actually on the lookout for generous people. But we're going into not necessarily talking about specific charities that might need your support, but actually what is happening in the heart of the believer when you adopt a biblical, godly generosity. Martine, let me just ask you about this because what is going on? Is there a benefit to being generous, or are you just letting those dollars slip through your fingers and it's off to another organisation? Somebody's asking me for money, and you know what? This is actually normal and this is good, but what's happening in the heart of the individual who actually gets the penny drops, and this is something that God has called me to in giving? What's happening in the heart?
Yeah, great question, Neil. And, you know, the funny thing is that the way God has wired us up is that actually we have less when we give our time or our money or our resources, but it feels good, doesn't it? You know, we get that warm, fuzzy feeling, which in fact is a gift from our God, who is a generous God in the first place. So I think, what does generosity do in the heart of the giver? Well, it connects us deeply with our generous Father and our Saviour, who has given up everything for us. He's given up his throne in heaven to come and be born as a vulnerable, poor baby to a virgin, and to give up everything on the cross for us. So, yeah, when we're giving, we're acknowledging that all that we have is his in the first place, and that we have a joy to be a steward of that for him and for his glory. I think also generosity has a power to restore dignity especially amongst the lives of people who don't have much to give. It's empowering for them to be able to contribute. We have this incredible story in our journey of generosity, where there is a story from Uganda in a time of violence and conflict, and the church in a village is calling on their people to come together to support one another and to give generously as they can. And in this story, there's a woman who she's incredibly poor. She's a widow. She's living with a disability. And she appears in this story with an enormous smile on her face. And she talks about how she wanted to give her one and only chicken to help the church serve others. And it's just incredibly powerful as you see this woman. And partly you're thinking, as a middle-class Christian in Australia, no, don't do that. You need that chicken. But you see the joy and the dignity that this woman has and experiences by being able to participate in the generosity that is blessing her community. And I think it just has a power to transform our faith. We know that Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart is. And it's just so easy to treasure our money and our stuff and our time. And so when we do feel led to a point to surrender these things to God, to trust him with tomorrow, to rely on him for the future, then it just totally transforms our faith. And that's just powerful.
For a lot of us,
I think also there's.
Yep.
Oh, go on, Neil.
I was going to say, for a lot of us, our experience of giving to God, because I imagine there's the attitude of the heart in this too, because when we're thinking of giving to God, we're giving at our local church. People give generously to this ministry here at Vision, but people giving to God, and sometimes we're not always thinking of those people who are in developing nations, the poorest of the poor that you've worked with there in India, and we're thinking that somehow or other God loves a cheerful giver, but sometimes I'm not really all that cheerful about this. How do we balance feeling good about giving and the responsibility to give? Any thoughts here on that balance?
Well, they're really great questions that you've asked, Neil, and they're really common questions for us as Christians. And, this is a topic that we feel awkward to talk about as Christians, don't we? We think, our giving should be done in private. This is a private topic. Let's not talk about it as believers. But when we do that, we're actually missing out on wrestling with one another, in spurring one another on to excel in what the Bible describes as this grace of giving. Paul describes it in Acts 20 as excelling in this grace of giving. And so this is what we at Generosity Path are trying to help Christians do. So we've come up with a something called the Journey of Generosity, which is an interactive experience where people can come together and wrestle with these questions in a small group, in a safe space where they are never asked for money or to give, but it's all about looking at Scripture, hearing stories, real life stories from generous givers around the world, and thinking about what it looks like to think afresh about God's generosity to us, his love for us, and how that can transform our hearts to then overflow in us wanting to share that in intentional ways in our community. And it doesn't need to just be in terms of giving to the poorest of the poor far away. In the Journey of Generosity, we talk about thinking about the needs in our community that we see right around us, and what would it look like to think about how you could use your talents or your time, your treasure to meet some of those needs. We know that our lives are busy and we are under a lot of pressures financially. And so in the Journey of Generosity, it's really about it's not putting more pressure on people. It's having a space and time where people can hear from God, listen to these stories and think, oh, wow, maybe I could take a little step of faith in trying to live more generously. And then talking about that together. So thinking about the collective, how can we be doing this together? And yeah, I think we need that as Christians. We need to do the Christian life together when, the rest of the narrative that we're constantly hearing is care about yourself, look out for yourself, buy more stuff. You'll be happier when you buy more stuff. So we need to keep reminding one another that actually that's not how our God works. That's not what it looks like to live as disciples of Jesus.
Let's come back to together in just a moment. Stay with the individual for a second or two here, because when we talk about a transformed life, what does it look like when you've got someone who comes to Christ? There's a surrender of a life. Some will say the last thing that gets surrendered is your purse or your wallet. But in that surrendering of, the cold, hard cash, the money that you've worked hard to earn through the week, the way that our faith grows and builds, the way that, in some sense, if you give, and some say you should give till it hurts, but if you give till it hurts, that actually increases our reliance on God as the one who is our sustainer. How do you reflect on the absolute incredible value of what it is to get released in this area of giving and what it does for your faith in God?
Yes, well, it's that choose to live is a heart thing, every aspect of it. And so much about how much you've got to give. It's about this willingness to open our hearts to God and say, you loved the world so much that you gave your son, and whatever you've given to me, I'm willing to share it with others, because actually I treasure Christ. I find my ultimate treasure in him, and everything else pales into insignificance when I treasure him first. And so I think, it's like trying to move a large ship, trying to steer a large ship. It's got to be moving. Once you take that first step of trying to have a posture of living more generously in every interaction you have with people, as you take that first step, God just leads you. Once you start moving on this, it's infectious to those around you. They see this joy and this excitement that you're experiencing in your giving, and that then inspires others to get on board and to join with you.
How do you think you should feel about giving? Should you feel somber and reflective? Or should you feel excited and happy? Sometimes, it looks a bit contrived, when someone's I've just given a lot of money and I'm really, really excited and happy about this. What are you thinking about feelings or even emotions? Just a quick comment, because it's almost news time, but, sometimes we wonder about our emotions in our giving.
Yes, I think the beautiful thing about the journey of generosity is that the Holy Spirit flips the switch for people from I ought to give to I get to give in their giving. And when that happens, it just changes everything.
Martine, just wonderful to be able to talk about this and to talk about that rice story. It really is powerful, and it demonstrates something I'm going to get your thoughts on, because when we talk about generosity being a core part of our discipleship journey with Jesus, this is the sort of thing that's at the heart of what you're conveying through the ministry generosity path.
Yes, that's right, Neil. And thanks so much for having me on the show. It's just a joy to have this conversation. Yes, well, it all starts with God, doesn't it? That everything that we have is God's. He's abundantly blessed us, and He is a God of abundance. And so when we take time to stop and receive that afresh as believers, it transforms our heart, doesn't it? When we see what He's given up for us, what Jesus has given up for us, it becomes a joy to partner with Him in bringing that hope and life and good news to those around us.
This word collaboration, because the rice story is certainly a story of collaboration, and you were sharing some stories around Ethiopia too. Collaborating together, oftentimes as Christian believers, we think, well, I'm going by myself to my local church, or by myself, I feel like I'm the only one giving. Who else is giving here? This collaboration, how important is it to know that there are others who are a part of the effort? We were talking a bit about that, being contagious, that infectiousness, but just knowing that others are being generous too and stretching themselves. How about this collaboration? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's great, Neil. Well, I think, it has a ripple effect. A gift isn't just a gift in itself. It has power to then inspire the recipient and bless the recipient in such a way that they then want to share it with others. We've recently had a story come from a church in Ethiopia who went through our Journey of Generosity course a year ago. So they went through this the Journey of Generosity a year ago, and at that time they could see that there were many needs and challenges in their community, but they felt limited and struggled to know how they could help. And they described themselves as having a real sense of hopelessness in their church. But when they went through the Journey of Generosity and heard some of the stories of givers from around the world in the Journey of Generosity and wrestled with Scripture and had a safe space to talk about their faith and this idea of giving as being a core part of their faith, they felt that they described it as a revelation from God, that it wasn't just knowledge or information, but they said that many of them felt like they were hearing directly from God during the Journey of Generosity and were moved to tears. And one of the scriptures that we look at in the Journey of Generosity is from 2 Corinthians 8, where we see the Macedonian church, and Paul talks about them, that in spite of their poverty, they begged to give and they found deep joy in giving. And so this church in Ethiopia felt really inspired by that. And so they embraced the ideas and some of the stories that they'd heard in the Journey of Generosity. And within just 10 days after doing the Journey of Generosity, they put together a team from their small church to start responding to some of the needs that they saw around them. And they started up a few different programs. They put on a free weekly lunch. Some of the medically trained members of their congregation started to offer a free medical service where they were not just treating some of the poorest of the poor in their community, but really helping them to feel loved and cared for and heard. And they also started trying to come alongside, to become friends with, and to counsel, support, and then provide training to some women who were working as prostitutes in their community. And as a result of this service that the church took for some of the prostitutes in their community, the women were equipped to start up some small businesses and felt known and loved and cared for in such a way that they had the confidence to step out of prostitution and even to come alongside other prostitutes and help them step out of prostitution. And it's just amazing to hear how this church in Ethiopia, they, after just one year after going through the journey of generosity, it has lit such a fire in this church that they have been reaching and serving more than 400 people each week, not just prostitutes, but prisoners, the sick, the poor. And they've found that many people have come to know Jesus as their Lord and Saviour through the sacrificial service and this real acting of Christians acting as salt and light in their community. I love it. At the end of this story, one of the church members says, "When we give alone, we can help a single family, but when we give as a church, we can transform the whole nation." And we see that here in Australia too. Movements of churches, of Christians joining together across denominations, uniting together to serve their community, to change their city. Yeah, that's when we see real transformation and change and blessing flow.
Together is an important word. Hey, come back to the recipients of the giving and, into the context of, serving the poorest of the poor, as you've been involved with in India. The people who are receiving something, and gospel being at the heart of where the Christian believer, has this sort of missional idea of giving. When you're when that person is receiving something, now they could receive funds that might be coming from some sort of state aid organisation. They're giving government funds or provision of whatever it does to take to sustain. Or when there is this fund that's coming from Christian believers and they know that there is a heart behind it, is there something different about the way people receive when they know that it's coming from the heart of an individual who is genuinely concerned about their personal welfare? I mean, even in the case of sponsored children and things like that, what are your thoughts here? Is there something different about the dollars when it's coming from a believer's heart?
Oh, that's a good question, Neil. I think, when the community members in this community that we were just talking about in Ethiopia see people that they know living sacrificially to care for those in need in their community, that is very real. They can see the sacrifices of time that they're making, the sacrifices that they're making for their own families in order to serve others. And that's really powerful. I think also, what we've seen in the Handful of Rice story in Mizoram is that the church initially had this mentality, and in a lot of parts of the world, we have this mentality of, we need to wait for. They needed to wait for funds to come in from the West, or wait for blessings from God, rather than how does God want to use us to partner with Him in the work that He's doing to grow His kingdom. So, yeah, and so I think one of the things that we are really passionate about at Generosity Path is to see churches and individual Christians across the world released to find joy and freedom in generosity, because it not only blesses and impacts the needs that they're seeing around them, but it totally transforms their hearts and their lives too. So we're longing to see Indigenous giving grow in every country of the world, and we've set ourselves a big, hairy, audacious goal of trying to spark a generosity movement in every country of the world by the end of 2027, because we believe that it just has such power to heal the world and to point people to Christ.
Wow, sparking a generosity movement, and that might be a local community level, could be then on a state level, could be on a national level. Let me ask you about the visibility of our giving. I know you like the sorts of things written by Chris Anderson, who has a book called Ideas from Infectious Generosity. The thought that, because, we sometimes want to say, well, there's a biblical foundation for not letting your left hand know what your right hand's doing and giving in private because God's going to bless you, all of these things. But where there needs to be some sort of a visible, more generosity-focused version of a group of people. I mean, we talk about individuals, so we could talk about groups, but the visibility of the generosity, how do you think about how visible we ought to be with our giving?
Yeah, well, I mean, boasting about our giving is clearly not good practice, but to talk about giving, well, that's absolutely biblical, and Jesus did that a lot. I mean, it was one of his most talked about topics. And so a few examples from the Bible that we see is Zacchaeus. So he was a very rich man, and he was very vocal in Luke 19 about how he would rectify his greed. And we can imagine how he would have encouraged others in the room to hear him speaking openly about giving his wealth away. And if he'd just taken Jesus aside to talk it through privately, the impact wouldn't have been the same. We also see in Acts, and we learn about the early church and the impact of the practices that the early church took in Acts. Giving was done publicly and in community, and it's for me. I feel that I've at times in my life I've kind of missed out on having my eyes lifted to practical ways that I could, as a Christian, actually live more generously and experience the joy and freedom in that, because I just haven't had practical examples or stories of how I could do that. I remember a few years ago when I was working at Tear Fund and thinking about fundraising and generosity, and I encountered some stories for the first time in the sense of what would it look like for me to pray about and ask God, what percentage does he want me to give away? Putting aside the figure that we often hear is all we need to give, for me to seek God on that. And then what would it look like for my husband and I to pray about every year? Let's increase that. That was the first time I heard this kind of really tangible example. And so I think, absolutely, boasting about our giving and how much we're giving, or that we're really generous people, that's not the posture that Jesus is setting for us at all. But it's about inspiring others to this surrender and to this authentic way of living out our faith. Just
Clearly,
one piece of that discipleship.
There's got to be a stewardship in there too. In other words, you've got an evaluation of what you can give. Generosity is part of that. But I want to get to, there's an individual giving, and sometimes we think of, oh, well, someone's a wage earner. They're earning a certain wage and they can give a percentage of that, or they want to give more generously and give more. But business people are sometimes considered to be like the cash cows. Business people sometimes being successful in business, the expectation on people who are doing well in business to give. How do you reflect on the sort of the orientation of a life, whether it's an individual life or whether it might be, that you're in control of a business asset and you've got a stewardship there. You can't let your business fail, but you want to be generous in all of that. How do you reflect on business people? Because sometimes they feel unappreciated when they're giving, but clearly business people are very important in the whole process of giving even those substantial gifts.
Yes, absolutely, Neil. I personally can't speak from the perspective of how a business person feels about this topic, but we do have stories in the journey of generosity of very successful Christian business people, Christian doctor even, and the sense of real calling that they felt God was calling them to have in the way that they ran their business for God, but then in leading them to make some decisions that are incredibly powerful and challenging. There's a story of a very successful Filipino couple who really had everything: success, status, very successful business, fancy house, and went through the journey of generosity and felt that God was calling them to sell their house. And amazingly, they prayed about it. They both felt that God was calling them to do this, and so they acted in obedience in selling their house and moving into a much simpler house. And in the story, they have such excitement and passion in sharing about this and what God did and the ways that He provided for them, and used the journey that they went on in wrestling with their wealth and using their wealth for God's glory to then bless people in their community. So, I mean, they're really challenging stories, but yes, stories of very successful, wealthy business people having that real sense from God of what He's calling them to do. What does it look like for them individually to trust Him with everything that they have and use their talents and their wealth for His glory as well.
And interesting that the whole conversation that we've had over this past hour hasn't been about wealthy people. And, to throw that in at the end there, I hope I haven't just sort of led listeners to a thought that it's only wealthy people who give, because the rice story that we were exploring a little earlier really just so powerfully demonstrates that you're never too poor to be generous and to give.
That's right.
And so for listeners, I think there'll be listeners who just want to be unleashed into something new. And that word unleashed somehow or other really, just sort of, a dog off the leash, letting it run. And so being unleashed into something new. I did mention the journey of generosity. And I also mentioned that Generosity Path, where Martine is the Australian Director of Generosity Path, already fully funded, not asking for any donations. But they have a free course that's available for churches and Christian organisations. It's global and it clearly has an amazing effect. And when Martine starts to talk about fueling a generosity movement, we might actually be excited about this. And so the course that they have, which is free, is called Journey of Generosity. And there is a website that you can go to and you can find that course. And maybe pass on a link to someone who's maybe in charge in your local church or a cell group, connect group type of leader. Generositypath.org. Generositypath.org. And Martine Wilson is the Australian Director of Generosity Path. Martine, just wonderful getting your insights today. Thank you for, considered moments. And I know I threw you in the deep end on a few little different sort of quirky type of questions about generosity, but every now and then we have someone on, just push you a little bit harder. And thanks so much for those expressions from the heart and just to understand God in his generosity. He's the start of it all. And we as followers of Christ get to be generous like God. Wonderful, wonderful things. Martine, just give that website one more time in case someone's scrambling for a pen. Generositypath.org to get a hold of that Journey of Generosity free course. Martine, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and your heart with us today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. It was wonderful to be with you. Let's have another chat in the new year.
Let's make that a plan.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.